Hello, everyone. This is BigReed with another episode of Gaming's Lost Memories. This will be episode 9, and this is going to be our spooky cast where we talk about some survival horror video games and anything in the scary genre. I just wanted to kind of highlight like a few memories I have and kind of my take on this, but also uh, one of the games in particular led me down a rabbit hole, which I kind of like completely forgot about. So we'll probably go down the rabbit hole of story time with the game Eternal Darkness, which, if you're ever in the market for, I think it's Generation 6 would be the PS2 and GameCube. Wow, are there a lot of great games that came out during that time? But my goodness, you're going to be paying like a pretty good price to find some of these retro games. I think Eternal Darkness is going for like 100 to 120 bucks, and it's not even considered like super rare. But I remember the craziness of Eternal Darkness, Silicon Knights, the developer, and Dennis Dyack, who was like their CEO and founder. Um, and I remember this at the time, but I think I forgot how absolutely nuts it was and like what happened with the studio and just the legacy of Eternal Darkness. So it took me down a rabbit hole where I have like 5 pages open. I was like, I completely forgot about all this. I was like, oh my gosh. So we'll kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about the horror genre just in general. So there were definitely a lot of creepy and scary games way before the original Resident Evil. But what I will say is the original Resident Evil, which came out mid 90s, maybe 96, that kind of created the template for how the modern day survival horror or horror game is and will be. Now, there's been some games, recently. Like I think Outlast, everybody says that's terrifying. I am too afraid to play it. But I would say 1996 Resident Evil comes out, and that's kind of like your modern day template for what the survival horror or the scary game franchise, will be. And one thing I will say, first and foremost, I don't know who else is like me out there. Um, I am terrified to play these games. Like they just absolutely get me every single time. The fear and the loneliness that you feel during these games. I don't want to say helplessness, but in a lot of these situations, like you're thrown in and it feels like that. Like you are the one that has to get through this crazy situation, whether it be emotionally or physically, as you kind of guide the character through it. And it's probably my favorite genre to watch on Twitch actually. Like all the Resident Evil speed runs, I throw Dark Souls in there, but hear me out, because Dark Souls is definitely not a horror game, but they are so unbelievably creepy, and like you cannot feel more alone as you go through this like super dangerous environment. So it gives me a lot of like the same feelings, and there is a lot of like creepy stuff happening. And I would say for the Soulsborne series, Bloodborne kind of is like the creepiest slash scariest, where there are just like horrible monsters. But kind of getting back to it, it's a genre that I've just always been absolutely fascinated by, and it's just so fun to watch. And it's really funny when you watch like people do speed runs of it, because you're like, oh, this I killed all these zombies, and they're like, I'm going to run around these zombies because I cannot be wasting ammo on this. And like the more you think of it, like that would kind of make sense. But could you imagine being like in a mansion and there's zombies running around, and you're like, well, I'm just gonna go in this door, and like you leave the zombies out there? I'd be like, no, like we got to kill all these zombies as we go. But there's like so many, just like, so one thing I will say, our medium in gaming with this genre in particular, so the horror genre, I believe is significantly more effective because it's a video game than the other mediums, whether it be a book, a scary story, or a movie. So hear me out here. When you watch a scary movie, yes, it's definitely scary. Yes, after it's over and you're like, well, great, it's nighttime and now I'm alone and I have to go brush my teeth or get a shower and like, be alone in your house, and, the house is settling and making noises and you're like, well, something's going to get me. Um, you just visually watch it and experience it. So yes, it is scary. Yes, it is creepy. There can be jump scares, but I think where video games really kind of knock it out of the park, and like we definitely, I feel like, own this genre in our community, is when you're playing it and you're in charge of like not you, so you're experiencing it, but like you got to get through the situation. So in a lot of like the movies, like scary movies and stuff, something's happening and the protagonist will either get through it or it just has a terrible ending. And I mean terrible not as in bad, like terrible as in, nobody really makes it out. You know what I mean? But it could even be like the original Alien, you know what I mean, where like something's hunting them, it's a terrifying situation, and essentially like one person gets out of it. So you watch it though, so you kind of watch their journey. You're not them. With video games, you are them. Like it's up to you to get from point A to point B, wrap up this story, and see what the conclusion is. But it's also like your job to survive, and it makes it so much creepier and so much scarier because like like they can get you. You know what I mean? That you have that feeling of like, okay, I might get got. So that's the first thing I kind of wanted to say is like, I think that's why this genre is so appealing and intriguing, because in the video game medium, it's just significantly more effective. Everything feels, scarier. Unless you're playing like in a room full of people with the lights on and it's like daytime, like, and you're just running past everything because you've been speed running it like 100 times a day, basically. Then it's just like terrifying. And I remember just like certain parts of specific games where I'm like, okay, like I always come back to the genre and I'm like, let's do it. This time we can do it. But I remember in one of the Resident Evils, I feel like it was the original, the remake on the GameCube. But it's early on. You find a dog whistle or something like that, and it comes with a note or has something like written, and it's like what to do. And like you're in this creepy courtyard, everything sucks, everything's scary, everybody's a zombie. You're just like, oh, and you could not feel more alone. And I think early Resident Evil, what makes it more successful as being like a spooky game is you do feel like you need to get through this alone. Like occasionally you'll meet up with, Chris Redfield or, Leon and two or whatever. And you're like, oh my God, we're fine. Like at the end of the day, it's you and like whatever you kind of rummage through and find. And that's like your gear basically. So like you're thrown into a situation where you're not equipped to handle it. And it's like, okay, how do you survive? You know what I mean? So I have this whistle and I'm just like sitting there and I'm like, I don't want to blow this whistle because I know what happens when you blow a whistle and there's zombies everywhere and it's a dog whistle. And I know what happens when you blow a dog whistle, dogs show up. So like you go out, on the balcony or whatever, blow the whistle and like zombie dogs come flying at you. And I'm just like, I hate this. And I think you kill one of them and get a key. And I'm just like, man, I don't want to be doing this. It's so creepy. So I don't know. Like I'm drawn to the survival horror, the games and everything like that. I'm drawn to them, but playing them is just something else entirely. But there were a few experiences like with that dog whistle that just kind of like stick out. So I don't know if you've ever had a memory where you're like, it just something specific happens and it sticks with you. There was a PC game called Sanitarium. It's like a point and click horror game. And I didn't think I was going to be able to find what this game was called because I didn't even play it. I was watching one of my buddies play it and he was like a big PC gamer. And I'm just like, you're in this like clock tower and it's all like creepy and like it's an asylum, I guess you would say. So like you already wake up under not so great circumstances. It's already spooky. I remember like a guy beating his head against the wall, like this brick wall. And then the moment that really stuck out to me that I still remember after like 20 years is you go up and like talk to this person and they say something creepy and then they just throw themselves down the stairs and like fall in this pit and die. And I'm like, what is happening here? Like, what is this game? Why are you playing this? But to go back to Resident Evil real quick, Resident Evil 4 kind of, I don't want to say like peaked. I would say it's arguably the most popular Resident Evil title and arguably the best one. Now, hear me out, because what happened is it turned into more of like an action game, right? So you're still surviving. Don't get me wrong. It's still creepy. But you have like way more, weapons, ammunition. You find this village basically, and all the village just starts attacking you, and then different creatures kind of show up. So similar, Resident Evil fashion, and it definitely feels scary, but it feels like you're more well equipped to handle the situation. But also, there's a lot of situations where you're being attacked by like a horde of zombies. So there's a lot of enemies. There's a lot of shooting. So it turned it into. I would still say it's survival horror, but it's a lot more actiony, and there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more stuff on the screen. So after that, with five, it kind of got a lot more actiony. And there's there's a funny boss. I don't think it really spoils anything because it's like, here's a boss, it's dead. But it's like a zombie bat caterpillar, and I just remember because I was playing it and my friend was playing it next to me on his console. Like, we weren't playing together, I don't think, at this time. Maybe we were. Maybe we're co-oping it because the fifth one was like big on co-op. But I just remember like we're looking at it and we start cracking up and he's like, it's a batapillar, and like we're just like laughing our butts off. And in early like Resident Evils, I don't remember that. But it seems like they had some like a couple weird games in the middle. Six was really weird. I don't think anybody likes it. Well, it's very actiony. It's an interesting game. But then seven and eight, they kind of get back to like this just terrible feeling of dread and loneliness and everything like that. So I feel like the horror genre is definitely having a resurgence. So you have your old school style, the point and clicks. Then you have like your more modern ones where you have your tank controls, you have your Resident Evil, Dino Crisis, Silent Hills, very similar. So you have like those games, which are all very good as well. And then you have your more modern, actiony ones. And I think they're doing a really good job with the genre, because I feel like there's just more of a market for it, especially with PC. So I think that's like one of the coolest things that like PC has going for it is there's such a large community, and especially with Steam. I think I saw an article the other day where Steam hit like 30 million users or something like that, which is absolutely insane. So there's just a big market there. It doesn't necessarily like have to start on a console now, which is really nice because at this point, the modern day consoles are basically just lower cost PCs. You know what I mean? Like, they jam a lot of parts in it, but they're throwing Xbox, PlayStation on it. So I can kind of like understand that. But the genre just keeps drawing me back in. And another one that kind of sticks out to me is Condemned: Criminal Origins. Another one where I played it, but I watched it first. So I remember, watching my friend play it, and it's like really creepy because everybody seems to be going crazy, and there's like a serial killer like out on the loose, and you're finding these games just have such a good job of making things so creepy. Like, you're picking up dead birds because they're dying for some reason, so it's related to everything that's kind of happening with people. Violent is one thing that I remember. Like, you pick up a lot of weapons, either pistols, shotguns, a lot of melee weapons, and they damage pretty quickly and like over time. So it's like a really close quarters. Things are jumping out at you, and you're like bludgeoning them to death, basically. But there's a really famous scene, and I just remember, watching this kind of play out. But as you're going through what appears to be some type of like shopping mall that just is vacant, and zombies basically took it over, is the only way to describe it. And you're going through, and like the screen keeps like flashing and everything like that because your main character is going crazy. Well, understandably so, of course. But you go one way, and then there's like, all of a sudden there's like a mannequin in the way, and you're like, oh, I'll turn around. And then as you're like turning around, there's like more mannequins, and then like you turn around again, and you're just like surrounded by mannequins and going crazy. And I just remember that happened, and my buddy who was playing it, which I do not blame him. I do not blame him. It scared the crap out of me too. But I just remember he like stuck his face behind me. It was like whoa, like diving away from like it happening on the screen. I was like, I don't like this. Why is everything so scary? But once again, I think the reason why we're kind of drawn to them is because of how much they pull you in, and because you experience what the character is, experiencing, so to speak. So, the character is going through this super crazy situation, but you are too. Like you're living it through them essentially. But a game that, also really sticks out to me, and anytime I think of this series, I know a lot of people, will think of Resident Evil, Silent Hill, which those are the heavy hitters, and Dead Space. I would even say Dead Space for like the more modern era. In fact, just a quick side note, Dead Space is getting remade. I don't know how the hell they pulled that off because EA has a reputation of acquiring studios and then being like, okay, time to die. No more creativity. And listen, I come from a business background. So occasionally, like on this podcast, you'll hear me talk about either game sales, revenue, or, really soon we're going to kind of talk about the death of a studio in a minute here. But I understand that that's one thing that's unique about our gaming industry is their products and their art. So it's like, okay, how do we get people to buy this, and how do we keep a healthy, revenue model that allows us to continue making games, but also it's artists making it. So at the end of the day, there has to be an idea. There has to be something unique. There has to be something special, that's at the core of why you're developing a video game. And a lot of the times, what will happen is you'll have a studio of artists or creators, you know what I mean? Or people that they need to be in a safe space to allow for the creativity to come out, for ideas to be thrown out there, and doing so in a way that if you're looking for, how do we know this is going to be, successful? Or let me rephrase that. How do we know this is going to be a good product? Well, keep going back to the player. So is this enjoyable? Does this enhance the gameplay experience? Does this enhance the game? Then we should do it. If not, like maybe we need to trim some of the fat and focus on like what the experience is and what are the good things about this game. The flip side is a lot of the times studios will get bigger, right? And then they'll have somebody come in from a business perspective. And I think that's kind of what happened with Dead Space. It's like, okay, all right, we need more Dead Space games. Like, keep making them. Well, how do we appeal to a larger audience? Well, maybe we make it more of an action game. Then by the third one, you have a game that's not selling well now because it deviated too far from the roots of what the experience was originally, mixed with, it's not selling well, it's not a fun game, or it's not as good as, the other two games. Then, they kind of, it just dies. So EA has a habit of, kind of doing that with franchises, and I hope it didn't happen to BioWare, but it really seems like it did. Okay, but side note here. Dead Space, Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil, like there's so many games either being remade or getting sequels, so I think you're going to see a resurgence, in a lot of these titles, and I think Capcom being able to remake, or excuse me, they're remaking 4, but being able to go back to the spooky roots, and with 7 and 8, Resident Evil 7 and 8, I think it basically showcased that you can do that. You can keep your franchise true to its roots, but also make it grow. And I think Nintendo's like the prime example of all of this. It's absolutely insane that, Zelda, Mario, Metroid, Pokemon are still crazy. Like they're the most popular they've ever been, after 35 years. Just about all of those franchises except Pokemon. So it's you got to be able to adapt and evolve, but stick to what makes your franchise successful, or stick to what makes your game successful. And I think when you deviate from that, you kind of see, people leave. They're like, well, now you have an experience that appeals to nobody because you tried to appeal to everybody. So you'll kind of hear me talk about like business, game sales, and everything like that. That pops up every once in a while because I understand. I do view it as an art form, but at the end of the day, like if you don't sell games, you can't exist. It just is what it is. Like if you you got to be able to make a profit. You got to be able to have a revenue stream. It just has to happen. That's just a side effect of our game industry. It's a product at the end of the day, right? It can be art too, but it's both. Yeah. So one game that kind of just took me down a rabbit hole because I always think of Eternal Darkness on the Nintendo GameCube. A weird development story, a weird development studio, an odd release on a purple kids console. Basically, like the GameCube had such a weird reputation at the time, so we'll talk about all of that. But then, like everything that happened afterwards too is just so strange. So you end up just getting a once in a lifetime game release on a console that it shouldn't have existed on. Like everything's just like so weird about it. And then you play the game and you're like, oh my God, this is so creepy. So Eternal Darkness basically follows, a main character. I think her name's Alex. I actually don't recall. It's been a while since I played it. But her uncle, okay, there will be minor spoilers here. Very, very minor. I will actually make sure I don't go into too much detail here. But she ends up going to her uncle's house slash mansion. Kind of reminds you of like Resident Evil 1, right? She's pulled there for an event that happens, and I'm not spoiling it, so she pulls it, and eventually she finds the Tome of Eternal Darkness, which is like this book made of human skin. It's like super creepy, and it takes you through, the history of all of these different stories involving these crazy ancient monsters that are trying to be like summoned into our realm or something like that, right? So you play through a lot of different characters throughout history, and they each have their own like different gameplay styles, different personalities. But it's like, hey, here's all these characters, and she reads it. The most intriguing thing about Eternal Darkness is it had something called sanity effects. So you had a green bar, and as you see crazy stuff or see monsters or just like creepy stuff's happening, you're taking damage, like your character starts to go insane. So as your bar like lowers, different sanity effects can happen. And they are actually just designed to mess with the player. You know what I mean? It's not good for the character either, because like, you can die and stuff like that. But it makes the game so creepy because it's like doing weird things like pretending to delete your game save, pretending to change the channel on your TV, having bugs, like run across your TV screen. Even small things like soon as your sanity goes down, the screen literally just like tilts at an angle. So it's like you have to like look at an angle. It's like designed to just make you uncomfortable. And then there's like other things that can happen, like there's a scene which it doesn't, this isn't a spoiler, but it is definitely like a jump scare. Like she goes into the bathroom and you inspect the tub because it's like your horror game in general, where like you kind of like inspect everything, like it's giving you like creepy words and stuff. But as soon as you do, there's a scream and it cuts to like her in a bathtub full of blood, like dead. And then like you snap out of it and she's like shaking her head and she's like, this can't be happening. So like as you get crazier, the mansion starts getting creepier, things happen to your character. It's one of the coolest experiences, in a game. And I'm surprised it hasn't been utilized more. So I say that because I feel like it's a really solid thing. And now I know Nintendo patented it, so maybe that's why. Like maybe like other companies like legally don't want to try to use it because Nintendo might sue them. But they patented it because it is so unique. And I haven't really played or seen too many games that have this type of feature. But it's just super interesting. Like one of the scenes, and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, like you are in the main like area, and all of a sudden you just hear like this pounding. The only way I can describe it is it sounds like a giant monster's like walking towards the mansion. It's like, and then it like stops, and there's like a moment of silence. And you're like, and then you just hear this like roar, and you're like, oh my God, like what is happening? But I distinctly remember playing this game, and I'm in like the library area, and the statue busts. So like, how there's like a bust of a statue that's like from the chest up. As you start like playing through the game, they start like following you. So like you'll walk by and they'll turn around, like they'll turn their heads at you and stuff. The paintings are like normal paintings, and then as like things start getting worse and you start going crazy, um, like the paintings will be of a sailboat where the sail is made of human skin, and there's like this creepy looking like skeleton riding, and you're just like, what is happening? But I distinctly remember I was playing one night and I had this like lamp probably from like the 60s. Like I don't even know where it came from. It was like a piece of crap. But I had my lamp on and I'm like playing it by myself upstairs in the attic, and it's nighttime, and the light bulb just like flashes, like it dims and comes back on. And I'm like, ugh. And I didn't want to get up, and I continue playing, and then all of a sudden the light just like flickers again and goes out. And so I'm like still sitting there now in the dark entirely. The lamp went out. I don't know why it went out, and I'm just like, ah. And I walk up to one of the doors to open it, and it's just like pow 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 pow. And I'm like, oh my god, like something on the other side just pounded on it. And I'm like, oh, I'm done. I got up, didn't even save, turned the GameCube off. I was like, I am out, going downstairs. I got no light in here. Need to get out. I was like, no, thank you. I will play this game in the morning. So yeah, it was really, really interesting experiences that if Nintendo owns the patent, like I don't know if you'll honestly like, ever see it again. You might see. I feel like other things that could happen, because that's such like a specific thing to patent that I feel like there would be a lot of ways to still do a similar effect, but in a different way that kind of like avoids it. But it definitely, I don't know, it just like creeped me out. Now, what's really interesting about Eternal Darkness is it was originally going to be a Nintendo 64 game, I believe. Yeah, so one thing that's interesting, it being developed on the Nintendo 64. So it came out in 2002, and it definitely looks like a GameCube game. Don't get me wrong. However, it looks like kind of a hybrid almost. Like it looks like a really clean and updated Nintendo 64 game in terms of like the aesthetic and like the blocky graphics at certain points. So just such a weird thing to even have happened. So it was a Nintendo published M-rated game too, which I find like really interesting because that just doesn't happen often. But yeah, so it was originally supposed to be on the Nintendo 64. Comes to the GameCube. Didn't sell a lot. Like it might have sold. I would hope it would have sold over 1 million copies. Yeah, so I just double checked. About less than 500,000. So that's a tough one because at the time the Nintendo GameCube, wasn't selling like hotcakes. Like you could argue, I wouldn't say it was an unsuccessful Nintendo console, but having come from the 64, it was. So now you have Microsoft coming in with the Xbox. There's 3 different consoles out. Sega's gone. And it sold 18 million. So I think the 64 sold for like 36 million, 35 million, something like that. But long story short, game comes out. Nintendo and Silicon Knights worked very closely on this. Nintendo publishes it. They own the IP. They own everything, right? So it's not successful. So this is kind of where things get really weird because I remember at the time the the creator of Silicon Knights being a very interesting character. So I don't want to like talk about him too much, but it seems like, especially at the time, and it might be a little bit different in retrospective, but I feel like he believed in his studio and he believed in the stuff that they were creating, maybe to a fault, like to a point where he might think that it's more than what it really is. It might put the studio in, harm's way to keep that belief. So this is where it gets like really crazy. So them and Nintendo, not working together anymore, right? And I forgot too. The reason why this studio was so hyped at the time. So from Nintendo fanboy perspectives, you have an exclusive in Eternal Darkness for the GameCube. So it's like, boom, we got a mature game. It's awesome. It's super creative. Like, this is great. But I forgot about Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. So they also worked on the development of that, which was basically taking it basically turned the original Metal Gear Solid. Don't tell me why this was a Nintendo GameCube exclusive. That's like I feel like another topic that I'd have to research a little bit because I have an idea, and I think it was because Shiggy told Kojima or asked him like, "Hey, it'd be great to have Metal Gear Solid on, Nintendo. That'd be great." But long story short, they remade the original Metal Gear Solid as a GameCube exclusive with the Metal Gear Solid 2 enhancements, basically. So it looked like Metal Gear Solid 2. So that's a controversial game in and of itself. But you look at the studio and you have like an outspoken, CEO or leader, like whatever you would want to call him. And you have two like games, Nintendo exclusive, that you're just like, man, from a Nintendo fanboy perspective, you're like, this is awesome. Like, this studio can do no wrong. It's almost like retro game studios where you kind of like latch on to like a kind of middle, like a mid tier in size, like game studio that just like is super punching above their weight. So they have two amazing games, right? And they have their exclusivity with Nintendo. Then they end it. And I remember this being like crazy. Like, I feel like I remember Dennis Dyack just being like completely wild, like, oh, whatever, we're going to go here, we're going to go do this. And then there's this game called Too Human, right? So this is kind of what led me down the rabbit hole. I don't know if anyone even remembers this, but this was like another ultra hyped up game as well. So Too Human was another one of those games where the hype for whatever the hell it was like unreal. So it was originally going to be a PlayStation game, and then they were working with Nintendo, so it was going to be a GameCube game. And I remember early images, like this is something I'm gonna have to like go and try to find, but I remember early uh, images of like this just weird looking interesting game. And so it's already bouncing around, so you kind of get stuck in what's considered development hell. And you don't want to development hell is when something's going wrong, or you're sitting on a project, it's taking way too much time. Something's happening with the development where it's just like you're making it but it's not working out really well, or you are going significantly over budget and now the game's at risk of just being scrapped entirely. It's like, hey, we need 50 million to make this, and you're like, we spent it all and we only have like half the game. Uh-oh, like what do we do here? So you don't want to get stuck there. And having spanned across three different platforms, it pretty much it reached that point. So it, this was just such an interesting time because I remember how unbelievably it was like one of the most hyped games like I could ever remember. Because at first it was going to be on the PlayStation, then like boom, Nintendo fans are like, oh snap, Two Humans going to come out, we're going to have this awesome game, but it just kept getting stretched out. So that leads me to believe, if my memory serves correctly, they were experiencing issues trying to develop it. So it was going to come out, and eventually came out on the Xbox 360. So this is where things get like absolutely crazy. So everybody pretty much knows that a lot of game studios use Unreal Engine 3. So Epic Games created a game engine. Geez, I don't even know how high up it is now, but Unreal Engine 3. And so many games of that era, on the Xbox 360, PS3 era, have that look, where you could tell if they were using Unreal Engine 3. But for whatever reason, like so many people did. So that's like the good thing. But also keep in mind that with Unreal Engine 3, it was like finalized and really like figured out, basically by Epic as they designed Gears of War, but around the time of like the Xbox 360, PS3. So Dennis Dyack, very passionate, very interesting person. I think sometimes maybe believes more in what, his studio was capable of at the time. And once again, their partnership with Nintendo is done. Keep in mind, once again, Shigeru Miyamoto was a producer of Eternal Darkness, and I think of the Twin Snakes, oddly enough. But to be working with Nintendo and working with some of the best game developers out there, a lot of people kind of described it as like they were being babysat and like kind of shown how to like make like fix up your product, you know what I mean? So you have your game, okay, here's how we fix it up to make it a more playable user experience. So like when you release the product, you can stand behind that quote unquote Nintendo seal of quality. And I remember at the time, I should have looked more of this up, him not being so positive about that Nintendo, exclusive deal that they had and everything like that, and kind of being like, well, like we're past that. So here's where it gets absolutely crazy because I feel like everybody just forgot about Silicon Knights, and for good reason, like they don't exist anymore. But Too Human, unbelievably hyped up, moves to the Xbox 360. This game has been being developed for like 10 or 12 years at this point, with the early prototype builds being for like the original PlayStation. So just think, from your own perspective, working on a game on the PlayStation 1, then going to the next generation, then going to the following generation. So like you're dealing with three different generations of technology and the same experience. Like, yeah, it's not going to be good. It might have been easier if this happened in like the last 5 years where the jumps in technology haven't been as crazy, but you go from the birth of basically, 3D graphics into it being figured out and then, perfected in terms of like HD. So you literally went from 3D graphics exist, the middle ground, and then boom, now we got HD graphics as well. So I couldn't even imagine like trying to lead a team through that and saying, okay, hey, now we're going to another, game engine, and we're going to another console, like our third console on the same project. But it keeps getting like even crazier here. Because then there were pieces written about, Dennis Dyack, one of the founders, or pretty much like the main guy. I feel like he became kind of like the mouthpiece for Silicon Knights. But the piece came out that he was mistreating employees and everything like that. So I think he's contended against that, but it just seemed like everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and the best healthiest time for like his career was during that partnership with Nintendo. Now, one thing I will say is working with Nintendo is probably like a huge pain in the butt. They are notorious for, even if something is popular, if it doesn't sell well enough, like they'll just move away from it. And I think they're somewhat like perfectionists. Not saying every game they make is good, but I think it's very clear, like when they're working on, their hardware, they want that experience to be as flawless and seamless as it possibly can be. And there's other developers that will kind of be like, well, release it as it is. You know what I mean? Like, this is fine. So okay, Too Human, hyped up. I remember one of my friends in the military. He was a big Xbox 360. Well, actually, he liked PlayStation, but the Xbox 360 was just like so much better at the time than the PS3 that like basically everyone just owned one between the two. So he's like, getting hyped for it. Everybody's downloading the demos and everything like that. And it ended up being, I don't think it ended up even being a game that was what it was supposed to originally be. Like I remember the original seeming like a shooter, like a shooter type game or something like that, and it ended up being like this weird like Norse mythology, futuristic Viking game. I don't even know how you would describe it. It was so odd. Um, but here's where it gets crazy. And this is why, we're going down the spooky game path, but also like probably why Eternal Darkness we're never gonna ever see a sequel. um, Two Human launches. They Silicon Knights sued Epic Games, and this is where it gets really crazy. And maybe, looking back, if you're struggling on making something or you're working with, a game engine, or you sign a deal. So basically what happened is they signed a licensing deal with Epic to say like, hey, so like if you're creating a game and you license, the engine through Epic, you would pay them licensing fees, and you're going to, I'm going to make my game, my shiny new video game with this engine. But if you're going to make a sequel, or make another game, like you'd have to either redo that license or include, hey, we're going to make 3 titles, so we're going to sign a licensing deal if you give us like a good deal on 3 titles. Like, would it be cheaper if we agreed to make 3 titles with your engine? So Unreal Engine 3 was still wasn't 100% at the time because Epic Games, they're making Gears of War, you know what I mean? And so they're still like figuring some things out. So long story short, Dennis Dyack, Silicon Knights, they sue Epic Games, basically claiming, "Hey, your game engine's absolutely terrible. You promised it would be this. You promised it would be that. We're gonna sue you." Now, lawsuits with big companies, litigation can take a long time, and it can also be detrimental because if you sue another company claiming this, you're seeking essentially damages and lost revenue for like what you're experiencing. So essentially, I think what was happening is they were just struggling. I think they left Nintendo. They were happy. I think they were happy to leave Nintendo. Like I remember the sentiment being like, "See you later. Like we don't have to be exclusive with you anymore. We're gonna go. We're gonna go hang out with our hot new girlfriend slash boyfriend. Microsoft's gonna treat us right." And Microsoft, I'm assuming, did treat them right actually, but I think the belief in the studio was way more powerful than what the studio was capable of. And when you're sitting next to Nintendo and, some of their biggest Shigeru Miyamoto is arguably like the greatest game creator of all time, pound for pound. Mario, Zelda, a billion other things. Sometimes I feel like he's probably too influential and famous for his own good. I couldn't imagine him coming into a room full of, Nintendo employees. I'd be like, anything he says, we're going to do. And you don't want that type of power, but that kind of happens after you just are so unbelievably successful for like over 30 years. Like you're the reason why like, the Wii was successful, like all of Nintendo's big stuff. So being with such a strong developer and those strong personalities is like such a good learning experience, and it's guided too. So you're in a safe zone, you know what I mean? And when you go out on your own, you have to be 100% in charge. You can't lean on, that other company anymore to kind of create your product. So what I think what's happening is the development of Two Human was going extremely poorly across three generations. I think they were just having trouble figuring out what the heck they wanted the product to even be. But saying all of that, they sue Epic. Epic's like, hold my beer. They countersue. And they countersue that, like, hey, they broke all these agreements, et cetera, et cetera. What ends up happening, and this is kind of like the high level version, is they win the countersuit. And it was originally for like $4.5 million. That's bad. That's a lot of money. Like when you're not selling games and all this bad stuff is happening. Well, here's the other thing. During all this litigation, it was found out that Silicon Knights was kind of like stealing their code and mixing their code in with their own like engine code. Oh my god! Like not only did they break the licensing agreements, but they were caught stealing code from the Unreal Engine 3 to put into their code. So I can't even imagine like why you would think that would be okay, but they did it, and due to like all of the lawyers' fees and all of that, they ended up awarding Epic Games like $9 million. So it completely blew up in their faces. And here's what else came of that, and why you're probably never going to see another Eternal Darkness game. All of their games that were currently being sold to Human, whatever they were doing, like a side X-Men game or something like that. So to Human, they had to destroy all existing copies because it had stolen code. They were made with stolen intellectual property from Epic Games. So they couldn't sell the game anymore. They had to destroy it. So it's like your biggest, most hyped game of all time. You're not even legally allowed to sell anymore. And they had to destroy any games they were making with it. I think one of the other things they were kind of like caught doing was they agreed to make another game with Sega and were using Unreal Engine 3 but didn't have the license to do it. So it's just like they sued, and what I believe probably because things weren't going well. So it was like, well, we're awesome. It must be this. And they just opened a can of worms, and they were found to be doing a lot of terrible things. So Silicon Knights, they're gone. They filed for bankruptcy. They kind of shut down. It's actually kind of sad because Eternal Darkness is such an incredible game. I really do like it. It's my favorite like horror game ever. They go to start another game with one of the other Silicon Knights employees, and I think they were trying to make a spiritual successor, so it looks like it's called Shadows of the Eternals. So they were trying to get that, and then Something happened with one of the other co-founders. There's a lot of I'm not even gonna say what it is, but if you look it up, it's pretty bad. I think he was charged with, you know, some really really terrible things. So that died down. Then they tried it again, I think, with another company to try to get uh, the Shadows of the Eternal, so the spiritual successor to Eternal Darkness. Couldn't reach the amounts. It was just it's too much. Like you're trying to do anything and everything to like be creative and do what you want to do, but there's just that long history of turmoil, accusations of abusing employees, like legal theft of Unreal Engine 3 code, shutting down a business. Like as all of this stuff happens, large publishers are going to be extremely hesitant to work with you because they know, based upon the history of like over promising, under delivering, legal issues, shutting studios down, it just makes it really difficult to be like, okay, you know what, I'm going to take $10 million or $15 million and let's work with something. And then you end up doing something like GoFundMe or one of those like crowdsourcing funding campaigns to do it yourself. Then you're relying on just like, hopefully we can get funding for this. Like you're crossing your fingers because you're not going to get it from one source. You might get it from hundreds of thousands of sources, kicking in $10 here and there. So shockingly enough, I know we went down that rabbit hole. Nintendo keeps renewing the Eternal Darkness, intellectual property and like trademarks and all of that stuff, which is absolutely fascinating. I think they should too. I think they should do it forever because I wouldn't want, any of that to lapse or anything like that. I would want to keep it because I do feel like they could do something with the sanity effects with that intellectual property. Nintendo has like so many internal studios to where I think from a survival horror standpoint, there's a lot of depth and, there's enough that is interesting there to make another game. And I think it could be successful with the Nintendo Switch. But that kind of takes us down the rabbit hole because I remember as all of this was happening at the time, like there would be a new interview with Dennis Dyack, and everybody would have their strong opinion on him one way or another, and it was just so crazy. It felt like they did intentionally leave Nintendo, but I'd have to go back and listen to some interviews. But that was like the feeling at the time. It was like, we're leaving. I don't want to work with you anymore. You're annoying. Let's go somewhere else. And then literally all hell broke loose and everything like just fell apart. And because of that, we might not get another title because it's been 20 years since, so 2002, 12. Yeah, it's been 20 years. So I would say it's not very likely at this point. But to kind of wrap up, if you haven't played Eternal Darkness and you can, holy smokes, find a way to play it. I do love that game. That's probably my favorite overall horror game. But one thing I'll reiterate is the horror franchise, or excuse me, the horror genre, survival horror, whatever you want to, spooky games. It's I feel like it's best experienced through the medium of video games. I feel like that's just one genre that movies can't touch us on. You might say like story based, receiving a story. I think you could argue that it's maybe better in a movie, but experiencing like horror effects and just surviving through what a scary movie would be is so much scarier when you're in control and completely by yourself. But that'll wrap up this episode of Gaming's Lost Memories. I'm your host, BigReed. So the podcast is now available on every single platform, basically. So, like, subscribe, follow me as well. And I'm going to aim to, have a podcast out a couple times a week. And then as I get a little bit busier, we'll do it, weekly. But also, if you leave a note or a review or anything like that, I take requests too because there's a lot of topics that are really fun to talk about. But thank you so much. I'm BigReed, your host of Gaming's Lost Memories, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.